Good morning, afternoon, or evening to everyone. Welcome. My name is Lena Sutherland, and I am the co-founder and CEO of Tealeaves. It honestly gives me the greatest pleasure today to welcome everyone to Lipstick on a Fig Tree. Yes, you heard that title correctly. The second virtual session of the World Biodiversity Forum in 2021, organized in collaboration with the University of Zurich, Biodiscovery, and Tealeaves. It has never been more important to support the mandate of World Biodiversity Forum than it is now. As such, we are grateful to be able to bring together such leading researchers, social actors, and decision makers to inspire action and achieve the much needed goals of the unified global biodiversity framework and the 2050 vision of the Convention on Biological Diversity. Today's panel will focus on biodiversity conservation and specifically in relation to trees and reforestation. Now, it's my greatest pleasure to introduce our distinguished moderator and expert speakers for this session today. Following this, we will briefly frame the discussion before fully diving into one I am sure knowing each of them. To a lesser degree, Dr. Pedro, but I'm sure we'll get to know him very well over the next session. But I'm sure it's going to be a riveting and enlightening conversation. For any questions, and I'm sure there will be many, please use the Q&A session on your screens, and we will address as many as possible in the time that we have today. Finally, as a reminder, this session is being recorded and will be available in the World Biodiversity LinkedIn group. If you have not done so, we encourage you to join this open forum of biodiversity members where you can share your insights, extend your network of people, and help evoke much needed change in biodiversity. Now, for our moderator today, we are joined by Dr. Meigan Aronson. Meigan Aronson is currently the Dean of the Faculty of Science at UBC. Dr. Aronson received her PhD in physics in 1988 from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Following her graduate work, Dr. Aronson held a postdoctoral assistant position with the Condensed Matter and Thermal Physics Group at Los Alamos National Laboratory and was a visiting scientist, and I hope I get this right, Natuurkundig Laboratorium at the Universiteit van Amsterdam in the Netherlands. As you see, I do not speak multiple languages. She commenced her professional research and teaching career in 1990 at the University of Michigan as the assistant professor of physics and earned promotion to professor in 2002. Michigan, she also served as associate dean for natural sciences in the College of Literature, Science, and Arts from 2004 to 2006. Dr. Aronson also has been professor of physics at Stony Brook University and concurrently the group leader of the Correlated Electron Materials Group in the Condensed Matter Physics and Materials Science Department at Brookhaven National Laboratory. Dr. Aronson brings a strong commitment to research, teaching, and learning. She has an extensive publication record and has been honored with a number of fellowships, including American Physical Society Fellow, and most recently, Fellow of the Neutron Scattering Society of America. She is passionate about mentoring students and postdoctoral fellows and has a deep commitment to diversity and improving the success of students and faculty. Now, Dr. Pedro Brancalion, all right, thank you. He's a professor of tropical forestry at the University of São Paolo, Brazil, and vice coordinator of the Atlantic Forest Restoration Pact. His research focuses on transforming restoration into an economically viable land use with greater potential to contribute to biodiversity conservation and human well-being. He published over 170 peer-reviewed papers, received the 2018 Bung Award, I'm hoping I enunciated that right, and was included as part of the 100,000 top scientists around the world in 2019. Welcome. Now, as director of UBC Botanical Gardens, which was established in 1916, including Naitobi Memorial Garden, Patrick Lewis is responsible for the leadership and strategic direction of the garden. Prior to joining the garden, Patrick was the managing director of UBC's Morris Young Center for Applied Ethics, as well as on the executive of the UBC College for Interdisciplinary Studies. He's a founding member and director of the North American Japanese Garden Association, sits ex officio on the Van Dusen Botanical Gardens Board of Directors, and is an active member of the American Public Garden Association. In 2011 to 2013, Patrick was director of the UBC Biodiversity Collections, including the garden, as well as the Beatty Biodiversity Museum. Patrick, lovely to see you again this morning. Now, Dr. Paul Smith is the secretary, joins us from London. We have an international group, by the way, here. We have London, São Paolo, and Vancouver. Dr. Smith, Paul Smith, is the Secretary General of Botanic Gardens Conservation International, otherwise known as BGCI. BGCI is the largest plant conservation network in the world, comprising over 600 member institutions in 100 countries. Paul is a specialist in the plants and vegetation of Southern Africa, from which he is from, we learned, and is the recipient of the New England Wildflower Society's Medal for Services to International Plants Conservation and the David Fairchild Medal for Plant Exploration. And as a side note, although I know he has many more things that are not included in that, which I'm hoping he'll have an opportunity to touch on later as we get further into a discussion. And without further ado, I will turn the floor over to the wonderful Dean Aronson, and thank you.
Well, thank you, Lana. It's a great honor for me to be part of this august group. And of course, tree planting dominates political and popular agendas. It's often portrayed as an easy answer to the climate crisis and effective mitigation for carbon emissions. However, it's not a simple solution. Planting the wrong trees in the wrong place can cause considerably more damage than benefit, failing people and nature. So given that the botanical community is currently assessing the conservation status of every tree species on Earth, given that botanic gardens and arboretum grow over 18,000 tree species, these institutions have an important role to play in helping to ensure that the right tree is planted in the right place, and that diverse native species are part of tree planting portfolios by incorporating biodiversity, botanical data, and botanical expertise into both the planning and practice of tree planting. So today's discussion will target why this may not be common practice and what could be improved in actions towards diverse and effective reforestation. Before we begin the panel discussion, I want to ask the panelists to very briefly describe their organizations and their role in this effort. I'd like to start with Dr. Pedro Brancalion.
Thank you, Dr. Aronson. So I represent here the bulk of researchers in the scientific community doing research on tree planting and restoration. So I also have a kind of practical background on tree planting programs in the coordination of the Atlantic Forest Restoration Pact, which is a multi-stakeholder coalition with 300 members that works together to restore the highly threatened Atlantic forest of Brazil. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Patrick Lewis?
Yes, I'm the director of a small to medium-sized botanical garden in Western Canada, and we have a large collection of rare and endangered species, particularly in the Ace or the maple family, and we work with BGCI, Paul's organization, quite extensively. Do a lot of collecting in Asia, and while I'm not a botanist or have a botanical background, being the director of this type of institution I'm very aware of its important role in plant conservation and reestablishment of forests.
Thank you, Patrick. And Paul Smith.
Thanks, Megan. Well, BGCI is an umbrella organization for the world's botanic gardens. We maintain a database of botanical institutions, over 3,600 of them in every country in the world. And that represents a sort of professional community of horticulturists, scientists, and educators, about 60,000 people just within our network. And I think a key point here is that Botanic Gardens have this sweet spot between research and practice. We have really good researchers who are carrying out work on biodiversity, but we also have people who could grow plants. And we grow about a third of all known plant diversity in the world's Botanic Gardens, including, as you said earlier, about 18,000 tree species. So deploying that expertise, mobilizing that expertise is BGCI's mission for people and for the planet, and of course for plant diversity.
Thank you very much. With those introductory comments, let's just jump in with the first question. And so the first question is, what are the main economic drivers for large-scale tree planting, and who are the main protagonists? Pedro, maybe this is a question for you.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I've seen trees being planted for many different reasons and contexts. So we have in one side large-scale monoculture tree plantings for producing timber, non-timber forest products, and then we have large private companies as the main leaders of this activity. So this is one specific type of tree planting, but we have also more environmental plantings aimed at restoring native ecosystems, providing ecosystem services, and conserving biodiversity. And then we have different kinds of coalitions of different kinds of stakeholders. So it's common to have corporations getting money for tree planting, for compensating their carbon emissions, and then they do donations to international NGOs that find local partners in countries like Brazil. And these local partners, they have a direct contact with farmers in order to find lands for planting those trees. So in this case, it's a group of stakeholders that work together, linking from like big corporations to local farmers in developing countries. And we have also local companies, not like big corporations, that plant trees for complying with laws. So like different countries like Brazil, we have biodiversity offsetting policies in which companies that degrade or destroy an ecosystem in one place, they are obliged to plant trees to restore and compensate the degradation in another site. And also we have countries that mandates tree planting and restoration in environmental fragile areas like riparian buffers. So they must be restored and maintained with native ecosystems. So there are broad reasons and arrangements for planting trees, but more frequently carbon offsets, carbon emissions mitigation has been a kind of main global driver of this activity.
Yeah, if I can add to that, Megan, I think one of the issues that we've tried to raise here is that, first to say we're not anti-tree planting. We love trees and we think trees should be planted. But there has, as I'm sure everybody is aware, been a huge groundswell to plant trees over recent years. There have been massive pledges made by governments under the Bond Challenge, Africa 100. I think at the World Economic Forum this time last year, the 1 trillion trees pledge. I think one of the issues with that, there are a number of issues with that. One is that it isn't simple. The analogy for me would be, let's say, and this is not as far-fetched now as it might have been, that you have a panel of politicians who recommend a particular drug, shall we say, to solve a particular problem without asking medical practitioners whether that is going to work. You know, for trees, anyone with a spade can plant a tree, just like anyone with a spoon can administer medicine. But that doesn't mean that those trees are going to do what you want them to do. There is a tremendous amount of expertise required that Pedro has mentioned in a lot of different stakeholder communities. And it's really important that those communities are engaged, I think, in these large-scale tree planting programs.
Yeah, I think that, you know, the protagonists, I'm being in Canada, those of you who are in Canada and are listening in would be familiar with the Canadian government's commitment to plant 2 billion trees by 2030. It's been in 2 budgets now, 2019 and 2020. and nothing has happened yet, but they have set, I think it's $3.1 billion aside. But the language around it's very interesting that they talk about forests and trees. They separate those very clearly. But they're fairly ambiguous about whether they're talking about extending our plantation programs or whether actually the interest is in restoring forests, which I think is a significant difference. They're much clearer when they talk about the restoration of wetlands and peat bogs and things like that. They've set aside 600 million, I think it is, roughly to restore wetlands in Canada. But they're very clear they're restoring wetlands. They are not clear that they're restoring forests. So I think that these 2 billion trees are probably likely large plantation projects.
So that makes me wonder then, why doesn't biodiversity in fact feature more strongly in tree planting projects and in carbon sequestration more largely?
Yeah, from my experience, it seems that it gets more complex. So when people, they get some funding to plant trees, they want to do it very fastly and at large scale. So when they realize that to do it rightly and with higher co-benefits for biodiversity, they have to start training local people to collect seeds and to establish forest nurseries and to learn how to manage different kinds of species. And these species not necessarily will perform well in the field. You have to learn how to manage them. And things start to get complex, much more complex than people initially thought it would be. Then they prefer for the simple, but sometimes the wrong solution, which is to plant few trees, like commercial trees that have all of the techniques for reproduction and establishment well established. And then we have a problem because we have a large enthusiasm with tree planting and a lot of promises. But when we try to materialize those promises, things get complicated and people, they gave up trying to do the right stuff. And also another challenge is that tree planting is a multidisciplinary endeavor. And there is a lot of influence from the economic issues of tree planting. So usually people plant trees on private lands and the landowners, they want to make a profit from tree planting. And usually when you plant a diverse set of native tree species, you are not allowed or you don't find a way to make some profit on it. And then the farmers, they may prefer to plant eucalypts, like here in Brazil. It's a single species, exotic, commercial. There's no restriction for harvesting it and making some money on it. So one of the challenges I see we have is to make biodiversity plantations, high diversity tree plantings, economically viable with direct benefits to landowners. That's, I think, the main challenge to turn the tide in terms of the tree planting approach globally.
Sorry, go ahead, Paul.
I'd agree with that. I think, there's trade-offs, of course, between carbon livelihoods and biodiversity, certainly in Africa too. For very poor people, you want a crop. You want to plant a eucalyptus plantation that will give you a crop in 6 or 7 years, because you know that you will do that, and you know that seed is available. The methods are there, and so on. And as Pedro says, it's much more complex to get livelihoods and out of more complex species assemblages, and particularly out of native species. And just to give you an idea, somewhere like Ethiopia has about 800 native tree species. Only about 35 of those native tree species are available through the tree seed centers. So that's a problem from the start. And frankly, farmers would prefer fast-growing exotics because, as I say, they can make money from that.
I think there are some small-scale examples of where there's been financial incentive to farmers to actually keep their trees. I'm thinking of I saw a report on a village in Kerala, or a pilot project in southwest India, where farmers are compensated, I think it might be 500 rupees per tree for planted trees, that they can get a no interest loan of up to 500 rupees per tree. And then they can put that back into like fertilizers or compost for their fields, that type of thing, to help with the, they have drought in that area, to help with the problems with there. So there are some pilot projects where they're trying to incentivize retaining forests and trees, but I don't know any large scale projects at this point.
Yeah, just a complementation. I think one additional issue we have to acknowledge is how the different stakeholders they perceive the benefits of tree planting. So it's common here where I work that we have the funding coming from a big company in Europe wanting to offset carbon emissions. And then they give this money to a big international conservation NGO that target biodiversity benefits, but they have to use the money also to show that they are offsetting carbon. But these conservation NGOs, they don't have lands. So then they have to establish partnerships with farmers who has the land, but the farmers doesn't want biodiversity or carbon, they want timber. So we have to find ways, to integrate different objectives of tree planting, maybe creating multi-purpose tree planting approaches, but also finding alternatives to demonstrate to these different stakeholders that we may achieve carbon offsetting with diverse plantations. We may achieve biodiversity benefits with diverse plantations and also timber production. So we have to, to find a way to resolve those trade-offs and navigating through these complexities.
That's very interesting. I wonder if you gentlemen have ideas about how we could take this to the next level, perhaps by doing better coordination between government and large companies, and then the people who will actually be responsible for making the biodiversity happen. How do you envisage that happening, or do you think we've yet determined what we want to have happen?
Yeah, I think the first and maybe the most important issue is to educate investors. This is something we are doing here, right? So we're talking about the complexities, about the scientific background, and sometimes it's challenging to talk with investors because they want simple solutions. So for instance, another example that it's part of my reality, investors, they want to plant trees, but I tell them, come on guys, we have here spontaneously regenerating forests. They are diverse, they are cheaper, they can stock biomass much faster and with lower risk, but they don't want it. They want to have pictures of local people planting the trees because it's part of their marketing. And it's hard. Sometimes we have to say, no way, we don't accept to receive your funding because it's not the best approach for planting trees in this region. So I think the first and most important issue is this one. We have to explain that there are many options to increase tree cover. Tree planting, I would say, using an analogy like Paul used, it's like a surgery, a very drastic intervention. There are many ways to have a healthy life. So we don't need only the surgery. There are other less intensive ways to bring health back to somebody, and the same way for the trees in a landscape. But also I think that we have to expand our vision of tree planting approaches, because like somebody going to a restaurant, our menu is so limited. So here I have developed mixed plantations with eucalypts and native species. So we plant eucalypts, they are harvested 5 years after planting. With the money of the timber, we offset from 40 to 70% of all implementation and maintenance costs. And from this moment forward, we only keep the native species in the site, but at the long term, we expect to exploit high valuable timber species. Mm-hmm. So, we have to mix different objectives and species and approaches in order to achieve the expectations of all of the diverse stakeholders that are part of a program.
So maybe I could ask my question in a different and perhaps more provocative way, which would be, can we imagine that biodiversity itself is a commodity? something that would fundamentally drive the desirable economy that Pedro has described?
I think there are issues with that. At the moment, as you'll know, under the CBD, this idea of national sovereignty for genetic resources is current. I mean, that's a principle of the Convention on Biological Diversity. I'm not sure personally. I'm entirely comfortable with us commoditizing nature entirely. I don't think it's practicable, for one thing. And I think also that amongst the drivers and the levers that we can pull is the public good. And I do think that governments and regulation have a place to play. We've been talking about market forces and market drivers. Those are extremely powerful, of course. But so is legislation and regulation. And arguably you could say that biodiversity, I suppose in financial parlance, is options trading. It gives us potential options in the future. That these are long-term benefits that governments really need to be cognizant of and taking responsibility for, which comes with the national sovereignty of genetic resources under the CBD. So I do feel that this is something that governments need to step up to as well, to ensure that that public good is safeguarded for future generations, and that we're not just looking at short-term financial gain sort of based on market trends or whatever the latest fad is in the market.
Most interesting. So of course I have to ask the question, what role do the Botanic Gardens and Arita play in large-scale tree planting, given all this background information?
I think that, Paul, you have more experience in the large scale, and so you should probably field that first.
I think there are a number of roles that we can play here, and in fact we will hold a conference. This is a quick plug from the 24th to the 26th of February at Kew. It's being hosted by the Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew, and BGCI, that is looking at this in much more depth. And the idea of that is to bring delegates who are investors in large-scale tree planting, practitioners, and also scientists. And the idea is to get them to leave with some tools, resources, and new knowledge about how to get maximum benefits in livelihoods, carbon, and biodiversity. So there are some great examples out there. And in the Botanic Garden community, we, for example, provide the Secretariat for the Ecological Restoration Alliance of Botanic Gardens. And those are small-scale, highly diverse restoration programs where there is knowledge that could be scaled up and could be used more widely. We also sit on a huge amount of data. There are 60,000 tree species in the world. My organization, BGCI, manages global tree search, the global checklist, which is used by IUCN, Food and Agriculture Organization, and so on. And we lead on the global tree assessment, working with Pedro's colleagues and others around the world to assess the conservation status of all tree diversity. And that gives us some tremendously powerful data tools as well around distributions of trees, how you grow them. All of that kind of knowledge sits within our community. The big challenge for us is deploying it. And so there's an element of frustration in that we're not sitting in the right rooms. We're not being invited into the right rooms, but we also have to take some responsibility ourselves, I think, and make it much clearer that, we are available, that we have expertise which is pertinent here. And that's something certainly that my organization takes very seriously. And it needs to be local expertise. This is not top down. This is working with those 60,000 scientists and horticulturists in the countries of origin themselves. In Brazil, we work with the Brazilian Plant Specialist Group. We work with the Botanic Garden Network in Brazil, where there is tremendous amount of expertise, and likewise in all of those other countries around the world. And our challenge is to get them to be part of the conversation, both planning and also practice, because we do know how to grow plants.
That's, the approach, the view I have out is from a much lower level. We, and Paul mentioned earlier on that Botanic Gardens sit in the sweet spot, I think you said, between research and the practical application. And we're one of the few gardens in Canada that actually provides a horticulture training program, because we believe that you have to know how to plant plants. And we feel that's very important. But I think that the sweet spot, there's another intersection there, and that's with education. And that's something that gardens, regardless of their size, have the opportunity to do. We do have, incredible resources. I think there's, and correct me if I'm wrong, Paul, there's about 2,000 botanical gardens in the world. And within them, we hold a quarter, a third of the known plant species. And this is an incredible resource for the public, and an opportunity to work with corporations through programming and that sort of thing. We run a sustainable communities field school where we directly target corporations to come into the garden and work on sustainability and talk about trees and the importance of forests and the maintenance of biodiversity. So there's a what gardens can do really depends on their size. The role they play can vary. They often cross over, but smaller gardens do have a role to play too.
Yeah, for me, one practical role, I think, of botanical gardens is to help, especially restoration practitioners, to reintroduce rare and threatened species to projects. Because usually they use more common species in their projects. And it's much more challenging to get the seeds and produce the seedlings of rare species, of threatened species, that sometimes you can only find them inside of protected areas where you are not allowed to harvest seeds, or in very distant places, in isolated populations. So I think that I would like to see, as a restoration ecologist, a better support from botanic gardens to deliver the seeds of high conservation value species. So the practitioners, they have higher chances of bringing these species back to nature and increasing their chances to persist over time by increasing their population, the connectivity of the landscape. So I think this is something that I think only botanical gardens can do it right, is to identify the species, collect the seeds, and help these species to be part of the tree planting programs. It will not happen like spontaneously. So we need this kind of external support.
You have to have there's fairly specialized knowledge in it's one thing to say to collect the seeds and grow up the specimens, but there's a world that fits in between those two things, where nurserymen and botanical gardens, the specialized knowledge they have really fits in there.
And there are many success stories. I think we've many gardens have worked to bring back species from the brink of extinction. There are one thing that the Global Tree Assessment has shown us is that 58% of those 60,000 tree species are endemic to a single country. So there are many more rare tree species than there are common tree species. Mm-hmm. And when you look at FAO's Forest Genetic Resources, State of the World's Forest Genetic Resources Review, the first one published in 2014, they list only 986 tree species that are used widely in forestry around the world. So there's another 59,000 out there, most of which are rare, which are not in mainstream forestry, but a large proportion are grown in botanic gardens, and the skills are also there.
I've found this fascinating. However, I think we're getting close to transitioning from the panel discussion to the audience questions. But before we do that, I wanted to ask the panelists possibly a naive question, which would be, given the many interesting points that you've made, if you had sort of one wish that somebody could grant you, what do you think would be sort of the best thing to have happen in order to improve the current situation? I'm going to call on Pedro first.
Yeah, it's a kind of dream for me. I'd like to see botanical gardeners partnering with business schools for creating like new business for local rural communities. So I think there is a great opportunity for these communities to make a living on biodiversity, to make a living on producing seeds and seedlings from rare species. But in this case, as I said, tree planting is a multidisciplinary activity. We need business schools together with botanical gardens to create these innovative business models for using biodiversity in tree planting. So I think we need this kind of to leave our silos and dialogue better with other communities in order to create innovation in this field.
Fascinating. What about you, Patrick? What do you think?
I'm going to echo sort of what Pedro just said. I mean, the integration is extremely important. This is the ultimate in interdisciplinary work, and it extends out into community development and equity and diversity of opinions and social sciences and politics and almost everything that falls into your faculty, Meigan, falls into.
I was expecting to see you soon in my office, to be sure.
So if there was one wish, it would be that there'd be greater integration, and we do try and work toward that, and we do have some programs for that. But it's a difficult slog, and but I think that's an important route to follow.
And last but not least, Paul.
I'd like to see biodiversity up there with policymakers and the general public and in the public consciousness at the level that climate change is. And I realize it's taken time for that to happen. And I think, we all need to value biodiversity much more. If you plant a single oak tree here in Europe or in where you are in Canada, 2,300 other species live off that oak tree. It's in their life cycle. I mean, that is cool. I mean, that's tremendous. And that matters because everything works that way. We seem to struggle to get that message across. 750 million people visit Botanic Gardens each year. They look at our wonderful array of plants, but they go home and somehow that doesn't translate into, or at least it doesn't translate enough into action and caring about the biodiversity that's out there and that we're losing so rapidly. So that's a challenge for us as well. It's a PR challenge. How do we make biodiversity more important in people's lives so that they care about it enough to get our politicians to do something, our businesses to do something, and so on.
Well, thank you very much for your important comments here. So I noticed that there are a large number of questions that have already been entered by the audience. So I want to turn the microphone, so to speak, back to Lana.
Great, thank you so much. There's so much to discuss. And I know we're running out of time, which I knew we would, because you're all fascinating and just opened up such a wide parameter of topics and discussions, all of which are so important. So I'm going to maybe list out about 3 we'll go through, and then maybe Dean Meigan, if you want to go through, maybe pick a few from the Q&A that we can address as well, hopefully within the time of 15 minutes. We'll see what we can do for a quick wrap up. And hopefully the discussions will continue afterwards as well, because again, so many things we're just scratching the surface on so much today. So I have to see here, what impact do you think climate change will have on restoring ecosystems using native species? Should we be considering novel species assemblages to take into account potential future climate conditions?
I think, just looking at plantation plantings in Canada, which we have the most data on, they're not looking at exotic species, but they're already looking at changing seed areas for replanting for plantations because of an anticipation of climate change. That's already taking place here in Canada.
I think one thing to be clear about is that natural systems, as well as man-made species assemblages, are dynamic. They're not sort of set in stone over any one period or other. And certainly the ecological restoration community gets that. The key thing there is that you're building in resilience. And one thing we can say for sure is that diversity equals resilience. The more diverse our habitats are and our plantings are, the more likely they will be resilient to climate shocks and climate change. So for me, that's another argument for conserving, planting, restoring diversity, is because that natural diversity gives you that resilience.
Yeah, I think we have to consider uncertainty as one of the ingredients for a successful tree planting, because like here, the rainy season is changing. So sometimes you go to the field to plant the trees and you don't have any rain. So it's challenging now, the logistics of tree planting, of especially restoration plantations. We're learning how to address it in practical ways. But I echo Paul's comment about the need to consider diversity as an insurance against climate change, because it's difficult today to have a perfect match between the species and the local site conditions. So I would recommend to bring some species from neighboring ecosystems that are sometimes more adapted to drought, so you can increase the resilience of your system and better deal with the unpredictable changes of climate change. We restore forests for centuries, and we don't know how things will be in the next year or so. So we need to focus on resilience.
Absolutely. As a human species, that with COVID, it also speaks to just
exactly.
so many levels. Resilience is so important. Very timely. So since we touched on tree planters, I'm going to actually skip one down originally in the order. How does one effectively communicate that trees need to be planted correctly and then maintained? And how do you explain this, like, to tree planters, the people on the grounds who are actually doing this?
I think it's a challenge. I really do, because there is this idea that tree planting is simple. And as I said earlier, anyone with a spade can plant a tree, but keeping it alive is another matter entirely. And the way that people find out that it's not simple is that they come back and they find that their tree is dead after a few weeks or a few months. And of course, we've seen some large scales of disastrous tree planting, which is one of the reasons why people stick to safe species that we know well and that we've always planted. And that becomes a self-perpetuating problem. I would say go to your botanic garden if you want to see a wide range of species which have been well maintained and well managed. And I think there's one other thing I'd like to say, and that is to some, and certainly in the conservation community, it is anathema that there should be any kind of management after you've put the tree in the ground. I think that's naive for tree planting. We're already intervening. And I think for any tree which is planted, then after management is required, and you need to make sure that tree, like any baby, continues to survive. And I think maybe that's the analogy we need to use. These are babies. You can't just stick them in the ground and hope they're going to look after themselves.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure many parents wish it was so simple. Sorry, Dr. Pedro, I think you're going to say something in addition.
Just being fast, I think usually people that think that tree planting is simple never planted more than a few trees. So if you have a minimal experience in this field, you see that it's quite complicated sometimes. So I think that we need a better dialogue between investors, the society, and the experts on tree planting, and to show that things are not that simple, and it's a long-term process. That's, I think, one of the main challenges we have for tree planting. People think that it's fast, and then they provide funding for 1 year maintenance or 2 years, but we may need some, at least 10 years to make sure that tree planting is successful. But we don't see any report about, we see people saying how many trees they planted, but not how many survived or for how long they are maintaining the trees. So as society, we have to better ask the thorny questions to these organizations and not focus only on the number of trees planted. Well, nice, but what else? So I think we need to be more critical about it.
Yeah, I think that also the language, I mean, tree planting is different than forest restoration or,
Exactly.
I mean, the tree plant, I have a number of friends who've been tree planters and, they on a good day plant 2,000 trees in a day. It's brutal. It's absolutely brutal work. They get compensated poorly for it. They live as, in my opinion, in abhorrent conditions. And they have sacks full of trees, and the trees are all of the standard shape and size, and all the same species. And take a step, drive a shovel in, plant a tree. Take a step, drive a shovel in, plant a tree. And that's different than forest restoration.
Mhm.
Right. No, I mean, I remember when I was doing my Bachelor of Science at UBC, and I had friends who were doing tree planting. They were trying to get me to go, and that's exactly what I heard about it. So I'll say I wasn't brave enough to take it on, but to all the points expressed about, maintaining not only the planting, but the long life, and speaking to that, planning economically for that as well. And also we're only as good as the knowledge that we have. And so it sounds like also more data needs to be at least supplied. I'm sure it's there, but just shared with people so they understand the importance of providing economic availability for long-term life for the trees as well. So I have one more. Oh, sorry.
No, carry on.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that takes us sort of back to Botanic Gardens and their role. I mean, BGCI has opened up a directory of expertise, which I hope to see grow, and that's easy to get to. It's online. There's GBIF, which is the biodiversity, the global biodiversity information facility, and which is open to the world, and all Botanic Gardens should be contributing all of their information to that. We should be opening up everything we've got. Sharing it's the easy part, really. Collecting it and getting people to pay attention to it, those are the tough parts. Sharing should be easy.
Right. As I say, sharing is caring. So we're all trying to do our part in that for sure here today. Thank you. I'm going to throw out one last question that I have a list, and then hopefully Dean Meigan's had a chance to go through the Q&A. I'll turn it back to Dean Meigan before we wrap up. So what types of speaking of economics, what types of economic incentives would be helpful in ensuring tree planting initiatives supported ecological services and provided long-term benefits?
I think, we can put a price on, and in fact, of course, there have been studies done on this, the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity. The Tealeaves study of, more than a decade ago now looked at this. And, natural capital accounting, of course, is something which is gathering momentum in certain parts of the world. And in the UK, we're told that the government is going to apply that to farming and so on, where a value is put on an ecosystem service, whether that be water, whether that be carbon. Ecosystem services also include things like recreation, aesthetic value. There's a whole range of them. Timber obviously would be one of those. But you can't, as we said earlier, commoditize all biodiversity. And it's possible, of course, to derive ecosystem services from relatively undiverse habitats and, obviously man-made habitats as well. So I do think there's a challenge there because only a subset of biodiversity has immediate intrinsic value to people. And that again means that we need to be thinking long-term about resilience and how we put a price on that, and how that becomes valuable. And as I said earlier, that to me comes down to governments and long-term thinking.
Yeah, for me, we talk about commoditizing biodiversity, but I think it could be easier to include biodiversity into existing agricultural commodities. So, for instance, as a Brazilian, we are still destroying quite diverse ecosystems for producing agricultural products and selling it to the whole planet, mainly Europe, US, China. So why, if people buy for these products, it will be hard locally to control for deforestation. In the future, I imagine that we should not only request like the big corporations that trade agricultural commodities to not destroy ecosystems, but also to restore the ecosystems that were destroyed in the past for producing the same commodities. So for me, we need a better market roundtables and market regulations and new trading systems in order to better integrate biodiversity into decision making. Today, we are not being able to control deforestation for producing commodities, but maybe in the future, we may be able to do this and to request restoration of the areas degraded in the past. So I think we have to integrate biodiversity into the global trade of agricultural commodities.
Great. I know we're running out of time again, as I knew we would. So much to talk about. Dean Meigan, do you have, I guess, a question or two if we can squeeze it in there before wrap up in the Q&A?
I hope so. One question that particularly appealed to me came from Jean Linsky, and I like it for its practicality. Can you provide examples of resources that could be theoretical, practical guidance, or case studies for responsible tree planting, for instance, in Canada or alternatively in tropical areas? And I suppose that, that the implication of this question is, how do we disseminate this kind of information to the places where it will make the most impact, both with respect to decision makers, on the top-down side, as well as practitioners on the bottoms-up side?
Let me respond to that, if I may. Hello, Jean. Thank you for raising that question, which was not planted. I should let everyone know. Jean works for BGCI, so she's very well aware that there are a range of resources out there which are online. BGCI works on the Global Trees Campaign, for example, the Ecological Restoration Alliance I've mentioned. And there are resources there in multiple languages on how to carry out ecological restoration, species recovery, planting trees, and so on. The Seed Information Database that Q manages has germination protocols for about 60,000 species in it. So there are a lot of online resources available, but probably they're mainly known about within our community. And again, it's going to be up to us, I think, to make those much more widely available to people so that they can use those. And we still have a lot of work to do. One of the challenges that I think, I'm sure Patrick will agree, is that, and actually his institution does very well with this because they keep records of propagation protocols. Many don't. A lot of horticulturists know how to grow something, but it remains in their head. And so you might think that for all of those 115,000 species that we grow in the world's Botanic Gardens, that we've got propagation protocols for them, methodologies. We don't, not necessarily, and they're certainly not publicly available. So I think there's much more that we need to do, but we do know enough, and there is enough information out there for us to be a lot better at this than we are currently. And that is about sharing that information.
Yeah, I think we have many examples of tree plantings that failed, but today I think we need a showcase of successful projects that could be used as a benchmarking to benchmark these projects and replicate their recipes of success. And there are many. I know people is very critic about tree planting because of these past failures, but I think we shouldn't have a so negative perspective of it. As all human activities, we never start to do it right 100% of the times. There is a learning curve. So we shouldn't be so critical sometimes and, kill one activity that has a so great potential. So here in Brazil, we have very, beautiful tree planting programs. I will give an example. It's one, a private company. They export pulp for Europe, they are obliged to have certification. And to have the certification, they have to comply with the Brazilian laws. And they restore more than 1,000 hectares of native forest, Atlantic forest per year. They produce the seedlings with local communities. They work very closely with researchers. But the problem is that it seems that today, the negative news about tree planting, they are more attractive. So I think we have to better find the successful projects and to create a showcase of successful stories to learn with them and replicate their findings and recommendations. I'm positive about it. And I think we are at the beginning of a learning curve that will improve with time and practice.
Yeah, I think that those stories are vital if we're going to plant 1 trillion trees. That's I saw one estimate that it will take about twice the land area of India to plant the trees we're talking about. So yes, we need those good stories, Pedro. We need to. It's not just for our souls, so we feel that there's hope, but it's we need those examples to go forward and really be the keystones to these projects. Otherwise, we're wasting our time, really.
Wonderful. I know we all love to take more questions, and we've run out of time here today. So fascinating, so wonderful. Hopefully the conversations will continue afterwards on this. But I want to put out a sincere thank you to every one of the panelists here today for sharing their time, their expertise, their insights. I'm sure, as myself, found it completely fascinating as the multitude of questions that continue to roll in, and we still have continued to ask and answer. In the meantime, in the chat, we have put a link to a film detailing BGCI's work in tree conservation. So hopefully everybody will have time to click into that immediately, at least at some point later today, and watch it. Also, please note that the World Biodiversity Forum will reconvene for their virtual sessions in May of this year. Pre-registration is now open, and we're providing a link for that as well. Attendees are encouraged to submit their own events, spotlighting their area of expertise, and accepted events will be listed under the banner of World Biodiversity Forum and promoted alongside the core programming. In the interim between now and May, we are hoping that the momentum of this wonderful discussion here today will keep going. If you enjoyed, again, as I don't know how you could not, quite honestly, but I'm a little biased in that area. Please do join the World Biodiversity LinkedIn group. It's a virtual ecosystem connecting a community for discussion and impact. So not just talk, but please people who want to do things. We have provided that link as well. Please help keep biodiversity its cause. Inviting your network, sharing comments, reports, papers, articles. We talked today about how important education, information is important today amongst so many other wonderful topics. As well, knowing time is precious. An immense thank you to everyone who's joined us here today. Your engagement in biodiversity, your wonderful questioning, definitely made for a richer conversation. So once again, thank you for everyone involved today. Be well, be safe, as we say here in Vancouver as well, be kind to one another, yourself and your environment, and hope to see you all again soon.